Hello and welcome to All Right, Now What? I'm your host, Andrea Gunraj, for the Canadian Women's Foundation. Gender equality and justice where we live, work, learn, and play is the goal, and it makes life better for everyone. This podcast is our chance to connect with insightful people and explore what it'll take to get there in Canada. The work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and its partners takes place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations.
Let's say you're walking home one night, listening to some casual Beethoven, as one does. If you're a man, there's a good chance you'll hear it just like this. If you're not a man, there's a good chance you'll hear it more like this. Because women and gender diverse people are expected to always keep one ear to the ground to reduce their chances of being attacked. Does that sound right to you? Visit awarepod.com to learn more and help fight gender-based violence.
Today I'm speaking with Alex Valoroso, Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Specialist with a focus on emergency preparedness and management. Hi, Alex.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So let me ask you the first most important question. What kind of gender equality change maker are you? You did the quiz. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the results.
Yeah, it was such an interesting quiz because honestly some of the questions I wasn't sure how to answer. But I got connector as my highest number at 38% actually. So, I mean, that's not surprising because I like to connect with others. I like to network. I like to see how we can all come together. But what I thought was surprising was that collaborator was actually my lowest number at 8%, which I found was a bit of a disconnect between making connection and then as a collaborator, you're often working with others. So it was kind of interesting. And then, yeah, I had creator, 31% and challenger at 23%. So it was very interesting to see those different groupings.
Do you feel that maybe there's some things that we can learn about how this quiz is kind of put together? Do you feel that there could be some ways that this is telling you a truth about yourself that you didn't think about before? Or do you feel like, that doesn't really reflect me?
Well, I think it's a way to sort of provide a bit of a reflection on the way that I do things. And so, we're talking about some of the questions we might talk about for this podcast. And one of them was, what are sort of my big takeaway? And not to jump into it a little bit, but it was about building community and networking. And so because I come, geographically isolated, I'm in a smaller community. And so that connection is so important. But then it's like, maybe could I be doing a little bit more to be collaborating with others? Could I be maybe broadening my scope a little bit more to reach out, and how can we really work together? Because I seem to be doing well in sort of the connection and the challenging, and the creator part was a bit of a surprise to me as well. So I think it's like, maybe like I could focus a little bit more, tune into that a little bit more.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you have had so much experience in the work that you do, and I'm sure in your life you've lived a life. Tell me about your core life lessons that you bring today, and how does that help in your effort to grow gender equality in Canada?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many things there that I could pull from, but I think the big one when I was reflecting on this question was the need for community, the need to network, and not network for the sake of networking, but networking so that you can have people around you that support you, that believe in the vision that you also believe in, that can add to it, that can share different perspectives. Because it can be really lonely work. And when, like I said, I am living in a smaller community, rural community, and there are absolute aspects and pockets of gender equity that are happening in our community, but I'm not tied into it maybe the same way that someone from a big urban center would be. And so sometimes when people ask me what I do for work, you kind of see the eyes glaze over and they're like, okay, I don't really know what you're talking about or why this is important. So having that sense of community is so incredibly important. I think it's regardless of whatever type of work you do or the type of work that you believe in. And so that for me is a huge life lesson. It's a core value, is building community. So go to the conferences if you can reach out and connect with others. Whenever I go to a new place, I might do a post on LinkedIn or my Facebook page and say, does anybody want to connect? And I've been so fortunate to be able to meet face to face with people that I had only previously connected online or reconnected with folks from conferences. And it's so rewarding, and it also helps to kind of reinvigorate yourself at times when you can have those conversations and just touch base with folks and be like, yeah, this is what I'm doing. And it helps to validate you, but also just, again, really comforting and helps to build you up and build one another up, especially right now in this particularly challenging time.
Yeah, I was going to just say that. What a great reminder for us that everywhere you go, prioritize connection. You may not know 100% the quality of the connection. You may not know the type of connection you're going to make with people, but if you just go in with that open spirit of, I'm going to connect today. Yes. And though it's hard and though everybody is feeling so lonely and disconnected and so taxed today, connection is always a gift, always something that we can use as a tool in our toolbox when we think about what we do to grow gender equality. I'd love to ask you about your passions, Alex. Tell me about your passion, your work, and how that connects to gender equality in Canada.
Yeah, it's so funny when I think about how I got into this line of work, and really it was this sense of addressing the inequities that I was seeing around me. And I don't even think I had the language at the time. I just felt like this is unfair, this is unjust. Why are particularly women facing a lot of these challenging issues, and what's going on here? And so I began to do a bit of, studying and learning and research, and really recognizing that we need to shift the way that we do our work, whatever work it is, because really gender equity is cross-cutting. I don't think it matters what sector you're in. And for me, my passion has been about sort of sharing that message that gender equity and social inclusion is incredibly important regardless of the work that you do. And particularly because I'm in emergency management, that's sort of my focus area. That's an area that we really, really need to look at, because for a very long time, gender equity just wasn't even considered. And never mind just gender, like if we take an intersectional lens or perspective to that, that also has been, not front and center. So for me, it's really, how do we shift this landscape? How do we shift this field of practice to be more inclusive, but not just lip service? How do we really make a difference for people that are impacted or going to be impacted? How can we mitigate against that? How do we make sure that we're doing the right thing as best as possible? And there are ways to do it. And I think a big part of that is awareness, for one. Again, like I said, a lot of people don't understand what it's about or why it's even important or relevant. But then I think it's also education and training for the folks that are up and coming in the work that we're doing. And also for us that have been doing this work for a little while, it's always a space of ongoing learning and application. And I think that's incredibly important to be able to do. So I'm really passionate, I think, about sharing the message and getting us to shift the way that we do our work and recognizing that there is an opportunity there and that we can do it. It can be challenging. And I think a lot of the investment in time is up front, if we really look at doing a gender-based analysis and looking at the issues and getting the information. But it's worthwhile because research shows that we have better outcomes when we take that perspective.
Well, 100%. That's one of the, key messages of the Canadian Women's Foundation is gender matters, and not just gender. All the intersecting factors of identity and experience do matter. Let me just take a step back and ask you some basics. When you're talking about emergency preparedness and management, what does that mean?
I mean, so we have emergency and disaster management. It's really this field of what happens when there's a particular, I don't want to get too technical because there's definitions for emergency, there's definitions for disaster, but something happens. Right. And previously, traditionally, it was very male-dominated sphere, and it's like this thing happens. There's a fire, there's a hurricane, an earthquake, and you just sort of deal with that incident, and that was it. But really, things have changed where we're now looking at what are the conditions that sort of exist before that particular event happens, and what goes on during that event. And then afterwards, the recovery phase, what is going on there, which long-term recovery moves into sustainable development. So there's this whole field of practice around emergency management that is looking at these different phases. And so now we're trying to see, I think most folks understand that disasters impact people differently. And I think COVID was an excellent example of that. People are saying we're all in the same storm, but some of us were in super yachts and some of us were in rubber dinghies and some of us were barely floating on a piece of driftwood. And so it's this recognition that disasters impact people differently depending on where you are. It could be your socioeconomic status, your gender, your access to resources. There's all these different pieces. And so when we look at emergency management, it's all these different phases. It's preparedness, it's mitigation, it's the response component, which I think is what tends to be focused on, and then recovery. And so we really want to take a look at all those different pieces because disasters are happening more and more frequently, and there's less time to recover in between them, and the impacts are being felt more and more. So I think it's really important that we begin to break it down and see how do we do this work in a really thoughtful way to mitigate against some of these predictable impacts.
The Canadian Women's Foundation was, in the pandemic in particular, was talking about shock-proofing. This idea of shock-proofing our communities from disasters with that gendered lens, that intersectional gendered lens. I'm curious, for many of us, the pandemic feels like a distant memory. It is not. It's still relevant. But tell me about what you're thinking will be the shocks, the emergencies we will really need to prepare for with that wise intersectional gender lens going forward.
I mean, to be honest, so in emergency management, we have this thing called an all hazards approach. So it's like regardless of what the particular hazard, so again, like your hurricane, your earthquake, your fire, whatever it is, we have to kind of prepare for these different impacts. And I think depending on the community that you're in, where I am right now, the chance of a hurricane, that's just not going to happen. We have wildfires, forest fires, flooding. Those are kind of the big ones, right? And so it's really thinking about if we are continuing to have these at a faster and faster pace with less time to recover, there's a mental health and well-being component that I think isn't always being addressed. And so that's a big factor. So there's the stress, there is insecurity around what's going on. Ability to access resources becomes, I think, less and less because it's just, there's so much going on all the time. And a lot of the community service organizations that provide these services in times of disaster are also being stretched thin. And it's funny, you mentioned COVID. You're right. I think we just hit the 5-year anniversary, quote unquote, of COVID, that we are not back at full complement. People are not okay. No, I don't think anyone is at 100%. And so, personally, emotionally for folks, not 100%. And then if you work in a particular business or environment, you're probably not fully staffed, and funding is always a challenge. I think we addressed a lot of these pieces in a project we actually did for the Canadian Women's Foundation, and looking at the service continuity guidelines for organizations, gender-based violence organizations. And so it's just recognizing that there's this ongoing pressure for people and communities and organizations that we need to think about. And so we know, and I don't think this is a surprise to anybody. We know that they say another pandemic is coming in our lifetime. So we have to, what are the lessons that we learned from this one, and how do we apply it to the next situation? But again, all these environmental components, wildfire, flooding, extreme heat. Then we add in, political challenges, environmental, social, economic, housing insecurity, food insecurity, fentanyl crisis. I think that's across the country. Ongoing racism, ongoing legacy of colonialism. They're all compounded. So I think we can't really treat each event as isolated, but more like what are the conditions that have led to this, and how do we support? Because we could have a wildfire in one community, 1 year, and another wildfire in the same community the next year. It won't be the same because we're social beings. Disasters are socially constructed, and they will change their dynamic. So that's another thing we have to think about. We really have to reflect on those pieces.
I like that phrase, that disasters are socially constructed and have to be dealt with smartly with some proactivity. I'm going to ask you one last nerdy question. If you had to pick the top underseen gendered impact of a crisis, of a disaster, what would you say is the top unseen that we have to start seeing?
I mean, I'm not sure if it's well, in COVID, it was called the shadow pandemic, and I don't think it's unseen for those of us that are doing this work, but it is gender-based violence. 100% is gender-based violence. And I think it's picking up a bit more awareness because of COVID, and there's a bit more focus, but still at the end of the day, I don't see mention of it in any sort of planning components. I don't see it being really considered. And when we talk about it in terms of emergency management, it's like, oh, well, this nonprofit will deal with it or this shelter will deal with it. But that particular nonprofit or shelter or women's resource center is also going through the disaster probably at the same time. They're also stretched thin. And if you as a municipality or community did not connect in with that organization around services or support, I mean, there's a big disconnect there. So I think it's really up to all of us to really think about these impacts. And we know research has shown again that in times of disaster, gender-based violence increases. And with COVID, I think there were like 300-400% increase was noted, even here in BC. So it's a big piece, and I'd like to see us do more work around addressing that and mitigating against it and really accounting for it when we do our planning around emergency management or just even our community planning, to be quite frank in our municipal and regional district planning.
Yeah, it takes everybody. I mean, I think that brings us beautifully into my last question for you. All right, now what? What's a powerful takeaway that you would give to our listeners based on all the things that you're saying, your expertise, your areas of passion? What is one thing that we can take away from this discussion that helps us be better gender equality change makers wherever we live, work, or play?
You know what? You don't have to be an expert in this field. That is my biggest takeaway. And I say that as somebody who is always like, okay, like, what do I know? What do I don't know? I think for me, the biggest thing is to get started, to take a step, to be willing to listen and learn. And these don't have to be huge pieces. I think it can be something not insignificant. It's small, but it's still significant, as if you see a comment that's inappropriate, calling it out if you feel safe to do so, because I recognize that there's also a safety element, and I recognize that folks that tend to be historically marginalized are also doing a bulk of the work. But I think it could be like calling out a comment on social media, or, say, oh, actually, if you look at this resource, you'll see why this is inappropriate. Or sharing a post around gender-based violence or why this particular topic or whatever it is important. I think these are really small practical steps that can have an impact, because the more we see this in our environment, the more we become aware of it and the more it begins to resonate. I remember I was working in government and I had written something and I had used the term intersectional, and one of the directors had been like, well, our executive director was like, I had to go and like Google what intersectional meant. I was like, okay, good. That, okay, amazing. That's good. And now, you fast forward a few years, people in that particular space know what it means, right? So I think that's how we kind of build up that awareness and start to shift, it's small baby steps, but it's still moving forward. Would I like it to move faster? Absolutely. And so I think that we can do that as a collective, right? It's taking these small steps, participate in community forums, take a look and see who's missing from the room, who's missing from that space. Nominate or advocate to have other voices in the room. When I'm asked to speak, I'm like, oh, great, but I actually have this person. Have you considered speaking to so-and-so for this panel or what have you? I think there's lots of, again, practical steps that we can take to move things forward. But like I said, you don't need to be an expert. You need to take a step, be able to be willing to start, be able to be willing to learn. There will be mistakes, there will be missteps. So I think you also need to be accountable for that. There's lots of great blogs and information, a lot of disinformation, but there's a lot of good information online. And this is also where that networking comes in, because then you get to see what other people are seeing and sharing and saying, and that builds your own awareness and your own, I think, capacity and competence. And so I think all those pieces really help to build something, and we can really work together to achieve gender equity and social inclusion.
All right. Now what? If you want to make sure no woman, girl, two-spirit, trans, or non-binary person feels out of options, out of sight, out of time, or out of mind, visit yescountmein.ca. When you count yourself in, you'll join over 104,000 people in the Canadian Women's Foundation's community. You'll get tools and opportunities to advance gender equality. This movement needs you. Visit yescountmein.ca and count yourself in today. Please listen, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. If you appreciate this content, please consider becoming a donor to the Canadian Women's Foundation. People like you will make the goal of gender equality a reality. Visit CanadianWomen.org to give today, and thank you for your support.